All right, just to give you a bit of background, so Lancashire used to have quite a thriving greenhouse industry, but then relatively quickly around the 80s, we saw like a huge import and influxes of relatively cheap produce coming from Central Europe, Morocco, also North Africa, which has crippled the greenhouse industry across the UK, but Lancashire was hit quite hard on that as well. Over the years, we have seen a slow recovery, especially the last 3 years, but the slow recovery is leading towards a lot of local-run family businesses being absorbed by larger companies. This is just something to keep in mind. At the moment, the horticultural greenhouse industry has been more or less described across the UK as more of a cottage industry. If you compare our greenhouse systems to really large producers, like we have around 1,100 hectares of greenhouses in the UK, whereas if you compare that to some of the figures in Holland, where you have 10,000 hectares of greenhouses. Most of the greenhouses we have in UK as well are very, very old. So they're like 40 plus years old. They're not really purpose-built for modern production systems, and they're shamelessly out of date in terms of their technology implementation, which provides a lot of challenges. However, it is an industry that has a lot of potential and where we can focus a lot of efforts. As mentioned earlier, certain areas in the country we can't change production systems very easily because of the soil conditions. However, greenhouse environmental growth conditions are not necessarily underpinned by what the local environment really does, because it's enclosed and it's a semi-enclosed system. Another thing to keep in mind is in terms of importation, we're importing huge amounts of crops still into the UK. Between 60 to 80% of crops are imported. So about 80% of fruits are imported, or 60% of tomatoes, thereabouts. And we also have in the entire sector a huge labor shortfall. And that has to do with a lot of the people that actually come and help with the picking of the fruit in particular. They used to come from Eastern European countries, but because a lot of Eastern European countries have increased their minimum wages and the living conditions are better there now, it's actually not worth for a lot of these people, especially from Poland, to, for example, come over. So they're facing a huge issue. Brexit didn't help either in terms of immigration policy. So there's a few challenges. If we go to the next slide. In general, there's three main issues the horticultural industry around the UK and in Lancashire faces. Number one, high resource use during production, so it's still quite costly in some cases. The second thing is there is a high market demand, but the problem is we need to increase our yield and also the quality of the food. So not just the amount you're producing, but also the quality. So the nutritional value, the flavor as well. And that's quite important, especially if you have a market that is very locally focused. If you want to, for example, deliver to NHS hospitals, they're quite keen on having produce that is very nutritionally rich for the patients as well. So it has potential, but we have very few companies in the UK that really lead innovation in that sector. And we really have to really challenge that a little bit. In Lancashire, one of the biggest innovator in the greenhouse sector is Flavour Fresh. You might know they have about 3 larger growing facilities around Southport area, and they're the largest soft fruit producer in the Northwest, mainly focusing on tomatoes, strawberries, and chilies at the moment. And I'm quite closely working with them. Actually, before I go on, the cartoon on the right-hand side, you can see is a kind of typical representation of a greenhouse. Usually the kind of like key challenges when you think about climate change in particular is that you have to remember it's a semi-controlled system. So the plants are usually enclosed in a greenhouse structure with glass usually. Sometimes you also have other materials like plastics can be used as well, but it's mostly glass. And what you usually have then as a result, you're very much influenced by the light conditions in your greenhouse facility, unless you use supplementary lighting, okay? We're gonna go into the problems with supplementary lighting in a second. But what greenhouse growers need to do, they need to optimize the heating in their greenhouse, the relative humidity, so the humidity in the greenhouse, sometimes the CO2 as well, because if you grow tomatoes, they actually are really hungry for CO2. They love CO2. So if you have an industry that produces loads of CO2, you could actually pump that into a greenhouse, and happy days, the plants just munch away on that. Just to give you an example, if you grow a tomato for 1 hour in a greenhouse, commercial greenhouse, CO2 concentration can go from 900 parts per million all the way down to 300 by just 1 hour if you switch off the CO2 that goes in. So they're quite hungry for CO2, a lot of plants. The great thing about modern production system as well, you can do some growing for some plants in the absence of soils as well, which we'll get to in a second, why that might become important. This is so some information in terms of climate change. What are the direct effects of climate change to greenhouse growers around Lancashire? One of the key thoughts is resource pressures, so actually getting material in, getting plant plugs in, getting soil in, but particularly around the energy system. It's quite an energy demanding system. You need to heat the place. You need to have electricity to have supplementary lighting going on, potentially. And sometimes you even need to locally produce CO2, which is absolutely mad. So they have these massive engines that are usually propane or natural gas driven. They switch on. They're sometimes linked up to the grid, feeding electricity back to the grid when they power them. They use the heat in the greenhouse and the CO2 as a byproduct to operate the greenhouse. The problem is, you can see on this graph, this shows you average prices per megawattage of electricity use, and you can see this massive spike, and we all know what happened during that time period, okay? And growers in Lancashire in particular, they couldn't switch on the supplementary lighting during that time. They didn't have the money to do so because of the tight profit margins. That meant we couldn't produce as much, and the quality of product was compromised. Greenhouses have the advantage over field growing conditions, is you can grow all year round, yeah? And this is where we really want to be. In terms of self-sufficiency, growing locally produce, greenhouses could be an answer to some of these problems we're having. The problem is we need to optimize these times of the year where light levels are not optimal or where it's cold outside. Yeah? But if you can't switch on your heating or your light levels to increase productivity, you're not better off than a farmer that has to leave their field in winter to some extent. Okay? Another problem is extreme weather events. There's some forecasts that we're going to see more extreme weather events, heat waves in particular. Heat waves are going to last longer as well. This graph is from the Met Office, and it shows you that by the year 2050, we can anticipate heat waves becoming more frequent and lasting for longer, up to 40 degrees. Imagine being in a greenhouse that's already quite hot, and you're being fried as a plant. Okay? A plant usually can survive for a day or so with high spiking temperatures. You will see some damage, but they can be okay if you have enough ventilation and cooling system in the greenhouse. But again, that's costly because it needs electricity. And there's different solutions to that. It's quite modern solutions as well. But over long periods, and if you have regular periods of high heat waves or high energy going into the system, farmers can really, really struggle. And they can lose their entire crop. And the problem is the horticultural industry, different from the farming industry, has received very little subsidies. If you compare that to other places in Europe, in Holland, for example, up to 30% of your outgoing costs as a horticulturalist can be claimed back through grants. In the UK, we don't have a system like that at all. And it's very hard for horticulturalists to access funding, much harder than for the agricultural system. Next one. Access as well to growing media. I mentioned that earlier. So some plants you can grow on non-soil substrate, but a lot of the growing industry, the horticultural industry, is very much around peat. I don't know if you know much about peat. If you go to the next slide. Peat is in Lancashire. Yeah, brilliant. In Lancashire, around 15 to 20% of the land in Lancashire used to be peatland. Okay? And peatland, as we all know, you might know, comes from fen or bog that has sequestered a lot of carbon over years and years and years. And what we tend to do now is we actually extract a lot of that peat to burn it or to grow plants in. And the horticultural industry is notoriously bad for it. Just to give you some figures there, in 2020, we imported and harvested a lot of peat from our land, which comes to more or less 4,600 times the emissions when you drive to moon back and forward. So you have to, if you go to the moon 4,600 times with a car, that's pretty much the emission you released as a result of the peat that we have been extracting. And in Lancashire, we have destroyed about 98% of our peat. And we're only now in the process to bring that back. So it has a lot of potential, and you can sequester a lot of carbon back into the system, but it will take a long time. You're talking years and years. And some other indirect challenges as well. You might have changes in atmospheric aerosols, which can increase cloud cover as a result of climate change, and that doesn't help with the light transmission. Altering growing seasons. There's no evidence for the UK per se in greenhouses, but from other industries elsewhere, we know that it can change the shifts of when, for example, flowers might come out, or when it starts getting warmer, so you might be able to move your growing season forth or back. Shifts in pest and disease pattern, some evidence for that increasing heat waves in particular could make crops more vulnerable for pest and disease attack. We also see supply shifts and demand issues there. So if you have a lack of, for example, importations because of borders being closed, we see empty supermarket shelf, and a lot of local producers at the moment, we don't have the capacity to fill these gaps because we don't have the infrastructure in place. And also, obviously, as mentioned earlier, regulatory and policy changes. So anything that might affect the supply chains, subsidies, etc., could potentially be quite critical there. Some solutions to consider. One of the key solutions is we can modernize our horticultural greenhouse industry, but we need to want to do it. There is a lot of potential, especially if you think about land that might be degraded, but you can't do any other horticultural practices, and it might not take away from wildlife conservation as well. They're probably good places to consider putting greenhouse spaces up. You can also have them on top of rooftops as well. It's also an option. But the problem is we need to reconsider the design, how we are designing them in the UK, what the materials is and the structures we use, and how we optimize resource use in particular. In order to overcome some of these challenges, I put together the Greenhouse Innovation Consortium 2022, which includes local growers, including Flavor Fresh at university, the largest greenhouse manufacturer in the UK and the oldest one, Cambridge HOK, Pilkingtons, down in St Helens, one of the largest glass manufacturers in the UK. They produce glass for the greenhouse industry, and we can optimize coatings on glass to optimize light transmission and heating. And Glass Futures and Signify, which is Philips. So they're kind of like a consortium we have to identify challenges and jointly between different industry to help to make the horticultural industry in Lancashire and across the UK more sustainable. Yeah, but I'm happy to answer questions around that as well. Is that okay?